Hello. This presentation covers an introduction to literary analysis, theory, and criticism. The content here will be helpful for you to consider when you are thinking through how you're going to approach writing papers for your assignments this semester. As an overview, I'd like for us to cover the following subjects. We're going to recall composition principles as we describe the process of writing a literary analysis. We're going to explain how a student literary analysis fits into the larger scheme of literary criticism. Finally, we'll explore various theories of literary theory to understand how literary criticism works. So let's recall some principles from our college composition class as we begin to write a literary analysis. First of all, literary analysis is first and foremost an argument. And an argument, as we remember, consists of two or more premises upon which a conclusion rests or can be made. The premises should be related to relevant concepts for the subject of literature, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The claim made by the literary analysis must be arguable, and it must be focused. The support for the claim must be academically sound, such as using peer-reviewed journal articles, books published by academic presses. Recall that you have used the RCC Library Online and that you have Dan Ream, our librarian, as a resource, and there is his email address for you in case you have a question for him. Librarians love questions. Your opinion of the literary work under analysis must be at the forefront of the writing, with outside support such as direct quotes and paraphrases comprising 10 to 15% of the overall word count for your paper. Safe Assign will help you determine this percentage, and each of your final drafts is set to run through Safe Assign with unlimited uploads so that you can examine the report and make sure that you're not overly heavy on direct quotes and paraphrases from secondary sources. Some relevant concepts for literary analysis for the broad categories of poetry, prose, and drama are listed below. Now, the way I like to think about this is that there's some intrinsic aspects to literary analysis that have to do with the text itself. And in each area, you have a list here, such as in poetry, we think about imagery, tone. In prose, perhaps we're going to look at a theme or the setting. In drama, there's the plot, and so on. But there's also extrinsic aspects of every literary text, and they can be social, political, psychological, etc. So these concepts give you a lens through which you can look at the text and begin to develop some ideas. So let's remember that the core of an academic argument is not just an opinion, but an arguable claim. For example, I think Virginia Woolf is better than James Joyce is simply an opinion. To reframe that so that it becomes an arguable claim, we might say something like, Virginia Woolf is a more effective writer than James Joyce because she does not rely on elaborate language devices that ultimately confuse and alienate the reader. Now that is certainly a statement that someone could disagree with, and that is the hallmark of whether a claim is arguable, is whether there is a counter argument to it. So you want to remember that your work is going to hinge on coming up with an interesting perspective on the texts that we're covering, or a specific text perhaps you'll choose, and making some point about it with which someone can take exception and disagree with you. That's the test. So again, an arguable claim is something more than a statement and support. It addresses the so what question. Why does your opinion matter? It also identifies implications for the questions. What is implied by your opinion? And it explains why we should care in the first place. How is your opinion relevant to broader concerns that you encounter in the text? An arguable claim also needs to be focused so that you can guide not only the reader's attention, but your own. A focused claim deepens an argument, whereas a broad claim generates a shallow or incoherent argument. So if you find yourself not being able to really get some good traction with examples to support your point, you may want to revisit whether your claim is actually focused enough to help you really dig into an interesting point that you'd like to make. Use active verbs and precise adjectives and adverbs when you're constructing an arguable claim, and this will help you with the focus. There's some examples there for you to review. Let's take a look at the overall steps for writing a literary analysis. First of all, you want to read the literary work more than once, marking the text and making good notes. There are some resources in the course that will help you really learn some skills on how to interact with the text so that you're not just skimming it, but they're actually reading it deeply and deriving some meaning from it. That's your goal when you're reading a literary work. And that's why you have to read it more than once. You also would like to make an impressionistic comment. This is your response, your general impression. These sorts of comments can be kept in your writer's notebook that you use for the course. These kinds of comments may end up showing up in your journal entries for the week. Another thing that you want to do for writing a literary analysis is to write an analytical review. Maybe you want to go line by line or section by section of an entire piece so that you can very carefully look at what the text is saying and how it's saying that, what it's doing, so that you can reveal that to your audience. You also would like to write a judicial inference. At the end of the day, in your judgment, why is this worth reading? You would like to make sure that your audience, at the end of reading your work, understands why you think that the text that you're looking at is worth their time. That's a good thing to help your reader understand. So, what is literary criticism anyway? And how does your literary analysis fit into the larger scheme of the subject of literary criticism? Let's take a look at this. The word criticism is derived from the Greek word krine, which means to judge, and the term kritikos, which means a judge of literature. Literary criticism is the reasoned consideration of literary works and issues. It applies as a term to any argumentation about literature, whether or not specific works are analyzed. This comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The NTC Dictionary of Literary Terms says it like this: it's the practice of describing, interpreting, and evaluating literature. So you have three verbs there that are explaining to you what literary criticism means. Here's the process. In description, we want to cite and analyze relevant passages. And this is why it's so important when you're reading to take note of what you're reading, because this will help you in the process of writing the analysis. In interpretation, we want to formulate the meaning of these passages by direct examination of the artistic, such as the intrinsic characteristics, and the moral or the extrinsic principles that they embody. So you can take a look at not only what the work is saying, but what it really means in terms of human morality. That's where interpretation happens. Evaluation is about examining a literary work carefully and deciding what you think about how good or bad it is. And then, finally, in justification, that stage of the process, you judge the overall work impartially, without personal prejudices, treating it objectively on its merits in the literary canon. Now, that may sound difficult to you, particularly if you're not widely read, but it is answering the question, why is this important? And you want to go beyond the I liked it, I didn't like it. You've got to look at it a little bit more deeply than that. So let's look at some of the functions of literary criticism. What is this all about? Primarily, in my experience as a writer, it is about criticizing literary works, and criticizing not in the sense of, oh, you know, we have to make sure we're understanding the word criticism effectively. So, we don't mean it in the colloquial sense where if someone's giving you a hard time about something, they're being maybe critical about you. When we criticize literary works, what we're doing is we're trying to bring them back to life and help us see why they're important and what they mean. So there's a little bit of an opening up of the meaning of a particular work. And that to me is what criticizing literary works is about. We also may have a particular theory in mind that we're working on. I personally like philosophical theories and psychological theories, but there's very many other theories that people can use to examine a passage of literature or a work of literature. And so one of the functions of literary criticism is for you to, from a particular framework, for a particular literary theory, see whether the work holds up in light of what the theory is expecting. That's another way to do literary criticism. And finally, we may write literary criticism to support literary history. And by that, I mean there is a body of work that exists, say, for example, with Shakespeare. And you would think since Shakespeare's writing is so old that there wouldn't really be anything new to say about Shakespeare. But we know that this is not the case because with the advent of technology that we have and the ability to examine texts, there's been some very interesting things to come up with the use of computer technology that gives us a little bit different insight into Shakespeare's composing process that we did not have 100 years ago. So that research adds to the body of the history, the literary history of that particular author's work. And so that's another function of literary criticism. Now, your work as a young scholar is important as you learn to describe and interpret and evaluate and judge literary works. You strengthen your ability to continue particular literary traditions or even begin new ones. And you'll see some perhaps insights into the latter as the course progresses. Now, what you'll do for your final assignment, your final writing assignments, is no different in theory from what a literary critic does when he or she examines literature. You're going to follow the same process, and you're going to produce a literary analysis that is interesting and merits attention. That's your goal. And because you're going to produce that, your work is important in the context of what we're doing here at the college. Let's take a look at some various literary theories to understand how literary criticism works. So, what is it anyway? Different critical approaches or theories are like different lenses that critics use and talk about art and literature. These different lenses allow critics to consider works of art based on certain assumptions. Criticism can help us form judgments about literature and can help readers appreciate and enjoy a literary work. So there's a reason why we want to try to have some kind of coherent perspective from which we are going to judge a work of literature and see if it's still meaningful or if it means in a different way or in a new way based on what the theory would suggest that we look at. Now here's a whole bunch of theories of literary criticism, and I don't expect you to know all of these. I'm just listing these out here for you so that you can see that there's and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some theories of literary criticism. And if you go on to experience the university environment and you get into higher level 300 and 400 level literature courses, you're going to encounter some of the various literary criticism theories, and it can be very interesting to learn about literature from these different perspectives. The classical literary criticism encompasses the writers primarily Plato and Aristotle in Western literature. So art must play a role in the perfect Greek Republic is one of the ideas that Plato was very fond of. His ideas about art and literature are classified as a moral criticism. That's how he approached looking at literature. Aristotle's Poetics is the earliest work that we have of literary theory. The tragedy, for example, stimulates the emotions of pity and fear as the audience identifies with the plight of the protagonist, say in tragedy. The resultant effect is that of purgation, or what he calls catharsis. So he's noticing how the work actually affects the audience. That's kind of an interesting way of criticizing a work of literature. This neoclassical literary criticism dominated Europe from the 16th pretty much to the 18th centuries. It started in Italy and then spread to the continent and to England. Uh, The role of criticism was emphasized, and the what you wanted to have was the right judgment about a work so that you could enjoy it properly. So this approach stressed the rules of the ancients as codified by Aristotle. And at this time, Aristotle's Poetics was considered to be the master key to literary treasures. If you didn't look at literature through the lens that Aristotle had provided in the Poetics, you were not really going to be able to understand literature very well. The neoclassical criticism advocates a judgment based on standards. It sort of resists the free play of the critical faculty. Perhaps it's not very imaginative. And in fact, this school of thought controlled the imagination of writers for a long time. It really, in a sense, sort of, and this is where the term Baroque comes from, it forced artists to try to find a pigeonhole in which to slot their artistic expression rather than to freely explore what the critical faculty could encounter. So it's just an interesting time. Romantic literary criticism followed upon that, and it was a revolt against classical criticism. The romantic perspective on lit crit emphasized the value of a literary work apart from any external standards. So it was only wanting to know the the goal was for you to understand the viewpoint and the intentions of the writer. This form of literary criticism ignored ancient authorities and doctrines of Aristotle in assessing a literary work. This was like there's a little bit of a rebellion going on here, and it was good because this is just how growth happens. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and then there's a new synthesis, and there's a new way of looking at things. So this is just the typical way that our cultures move forward. Romantic criticism is entirely subjective, which is why some really didn't like it. It expresses what a critic feels about a work regardless of what others say. So often new readings are imposed upon a text that cause readers to see the literary work in a new and perhaps unintended light, even creating the work anew. So there's some very interesting stuff going on in lit crit in the 18th and 19th centuries that kind of broke us out of the box and increased our enjoyment of literature and really allowed artistic expression to flourish. Now, modernist criticism, excuse me, modernist literary criticism was probably when I think of modernist lit crit, I think of T.S. Eliot because he's our most significant and enduring contributor to the ideas surrounding poetry, at least. And his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, said this idea of impersonality was his way of rejecting the idea of poetry as just mere self-expression, just, you know, going with your feelings and everything that you feel is somehow poetic. And he was sort of rejecting that notion. Eliot attacked the ideas of originality, self-expression, and the emphasis on the individual, which really was what Romanticism birthed. Poetry for Eliot was not a pouring out of personal emotion and personal experience, but it's a transcending of the individual by a sense of tradition which speaks through and is transmitted by the individual poet. The best part of a poet's work, he says, are not those which are the most original, but those in which the voice of his predecessors can be most clearly heard speaking through him. Hence, there's a large distinction to be drawn between the mind of the individual, experiencing human being, and the voice which speaks the poetry. So what Eliot's trying to get at is that we need to understand the value of poetry, not simply be in the way it expresses one's personal feelings, but also as it expresses a connection to a literary tradition or a sense of connectedness between eras, epochs of time, and previous writers, and so that there's a coherence that is very much in Eliot's mind, is he's not wanting to just blow the thing up and make it a free for all. He brings back a sort of let's not forget about traditions and how that should and often does affect an individual's talent. Very interesting perspective that he put forth. I.A. Richards is another person that was very instrumental in bringing this kind of literary criticism to the forefront, and these were all British critics. So let's take a look at new criticism. It's a type of formalist meaning about relating to form, literary criticism that developed in the early 20th century, peaking around the 40s and 50s. Reader response, author intention, and historical and cultural context are completely ignored. New critics perform a close reading of the text and believe the structure and meaning of the text should not be examined separately. This is especially going to cause the person involved in doing new criticism to appreciate the use of literary devices in a text. And so this is an interesting approach. New criticism has sometimes been called an objective approach to literature. It shows the influence of rationalism and science, which should not be a surprise to us if we remember in the historical timeline, in the early part and the middle part of the 20th century, we had just come through 2 world wars in which science played a very large role. And so remember that the cultural milieu in which art is happening is necessarily going to affect not only the way art is produced, but the way that it's received. So that's what's going on with new criticism. Biographical criticism considers that literature is written by actual people. It is important that you understand the writer's life so that you can comprehend their work, that the writer's experience shapes the creation of the work. So this is kind of a ping back to Romanticism in a way. There's a practical advantage to biographical criticism is that it tends to illuminate a text by providing a sort of backstory. When you're using biographical criticism, you want to be judicious by basing your interpretation on what is in the text itself and not solely on the writer's life. So if you decide you want to look at a writer's life and decide how what they had been experiencing in the time period, in the culture in which they lived, in the events in which they live, and you want to take a look at how that would have shaped their work, you still have to deal with the work. You don't get to just write about the writer's life. That would not be biographical criticism. But when I took, for example, a semester of Franz Kafka in my last year of my undergraduate program, I was so intrigued by his work that I read all of his letters and his journals that were available to us at that time because I wanted to understand what was going on with this writer, that he was presenting his stories in such an unusual way. And my professor very much disagreed with me because he was coming from the perspective of new criticism, in which none of that really matters. And so he and I had arguments over my papers, but that was okay. I knew that I was coming from a recognized perspective in literary criticism and that I wasn't just making it up. Historical criticism is perhaps a little bit broader than biographical. It investigates the social, cultural, and intellectual contexts that produce the work. So it's going to include the writer's biography and their milieu, and it's, excuse me, it's going to have attention paid to, is the way I guess I want to say this. When you're doing historical criticism, you want to take a look at who the original audience was as opposed to today's audience. That's the primary thing about historical criticism that you have to get clear. This is particularly very important when you are trying to do a close analysis, interpretation, criticism of ancient texts, such as we are covering in this course. It's very easy to misread those texts if we do not learn how to put ourselves in the mind of the original audience and understand the writer's circumstances. And if we don't start from there, if we start from the 21st century and say what something means, we are going to very often not understand what the text is saying. And some of our lectures will cover that. So another thing that historical criticism does, it examines how a text's meaning changes over time. Maybe there are certain connotations of words and images that change that will affect the way the text is read and received in subsequent eras. So that's another thing that historical criticism looks at. Another kind of criticism, and it happens to be the one that I find to be very interesting, is psychological criticism. Psychological criticism owes a great debt to the work of Sigmund Freud and some of his followers, including Carl Jung. Their attention being paid to the painful memories that are repressed and stored in the subconscious, especially from the time we are children when we are most vulnerable, informs literature, and that great literature truthfully reflects life. And so if you look at a work of literature and you look at the writer's background and things that may have happened to them to influence them to look at the world in a particular way, then this can be a very enlightening way to criticize a literary text. There's three general approaches that can be taken in psychological criticism. You can look at the creative process, such as how, what is genius and how is it related to the mental functions that are going on here with the development of this work, or how does this work impact the mind of the reader? So, because there's this idea that the text makes meaning not only from what the writer's doing, but also from what the reader is doing. So there's this angle of looking at the artistic expression from the angle of what's going on psychologically within not the writer and the observer in terms of their creative process. There's also psychological study of an artist, which is part of what I was doing when I was looking at the biographical information on Kafka. There's also an analysis of fictional characters. Freud's analysis of Oedipus in the Sophocles play is the prototype for this. So we look at a character in a play or in a novel, and we are trying to understand their psychology. There's an attempt sometimes in psychological criticism to apply modern insights to fictional people. And this is something that irritates other critics who find psychological criticism to be a bucket of hogwash. But psychological criticism is a way to understand characters, not diagnose them. So if we just remember that every theory of literary criticism has its limits as well as its benefits, then we can stay on track with the criticism. There's another kind of criticism called mythological, and it seeks recurrent universal patterns and explores the artist's common humanity as opposed to the individual emphasis in psychological criticism. So it's putting the artist, the writer, in the context of the greater scheme of humanity. So this is an interesting kind of criticism because it combines insights from anthropology, psychology, history, comparative religion. It's a big field in terms of the content that it covers. So one of the things that you can do is you can look at, in mythological criticism, you can look at archetype or symbols or characters or situations or images. This is all of these are examples of archetype that they evoke a deep universal response in us. And if you take mythology with me, for example, these are going to be some of the things that we might look at. We're going to look at archetypes. The hero, like Luke Skywalker or Beowulf. The outcast, such as Cain in the Bible. The quest, Lord of the Rings, is a quest story. Say we have a sacrificial king, as in the story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then we have another archetype about evil personified, such as the Wicked Witch of the West or the Borg in Star Trek. So archetypes are recurring, universal patterns that we see throughout time and space, throughout geography, throughout the epochs of time. And so why mythological criticism is interesting to me is that it helps me to create a sense of universalism. It's important for me to see that it's how can I put this? That there are common stories, common encounters that human beings have throughout time and space, and we can keep having that conversation, and we can keep talking about what happens with the quest. What happens? What is a hero? How do I, if I want to know how to be a hero in a situation, what can I learn from Spider-Man? What can I learn from Braveheart movie? You see, so there's a reason for looking at mythological criticism, because it helps us get a really big perspective on time and space with regard to human artistic expression. There's another kind of criticism called sociological criticism, and it looks at literature in terms of the cultural, economic, and political context in which it was written or received, because art's not created in a vacuum, and that there's a relationship between the author and society, including their social status, their values, and the role of the audience in shaping the literature. Marxist criticism falls into this category. Marxist criticism tends to take a look at the economic and political elements of art, and it explores ideological content, and it says that the content determines the form, that what you're meaning to say is going to determine how it shows up in what kind of genre, perhaps. So therefore, all art is political. There's a danger in doing sociological criticism, because you can get quite involved emotionally with it, and sometimes the critic can impose their own personal politics on a literary work, and that can sort of sway the evaluation really on the work. And this is why in the slide in which we talked about the phase, the steps that you go through to create a literary analysis, that when you get to that final judgment stage, that you want to be objective. No matter what lens you're going to look at the text through, you want to make sure that your passions are not overriding your good sense. So, but there is a value in sociological criticism that we can't ignore. And that is that it illuminates political and economic dimensions of literature that other approaches may overlook. There's another kind of criticism called gender criticism, and that examines how sexual identity influences the creation and the reception of literary works. And this began with the feminist movement, which itself was influenced by sociology, psychology, anthropology. Feminist critics see the world from the perspective that it's saturated with male-produced assumptions, and the purpose behind gender criticism is that it seeks to correct this imbalance by battling what they call patriarchal attitudes. There's some merit to gender criticism, trust me. Feminist criticism analyzes how an author's gender and sexual identity influence their ideas. And it's also very useful if you're wanting to conduct an examination of the social forces that are responsible for gender inequality. So that's one way that gender criticism is used in a larger context of academia, or even beyond academia. Gender criticism expands beyond the original feminist perspective because it includes attention to different sexual orientations. The men's movement, which is not a rejection of feminism, just like, honestly, feminism is not a rejection of men, but the men's movement is a contemporary rediscovery of masculinity. And so the gender criticism has sort of prompted men to look at their assumptions and how they think about and do things. And we've seen a lot of that happening here in the last several months with the Me Too movement. So there's I want you to understand that criticism, gender criticism in particular, can be quite inflammatory and dynamic and passionate and interesting to engage with. Deconstructionist criticism rejects traditional assumption that language can actually accurately represent reality. Because language is fundamentally unstable itself, and therefore literary texts have no fixed meaning. This is a little bit nerve-wracking for a lot of people. The idea that signs, excuse me, cannot coincide with what is signified, or that an actual expression does not equal what's being expressed. And we know this is a thing because every one of us has said something at one point or another that did not get heard by the hearer in the way we intended. So there is a thing here. But in deconstructionist criticism, the attention shifts from what is being said to how language is being used in a text. There's a bit of a paradox because deconstructionist criticism often resembles formalist criticism because both involve very close reading. But deconstructionist critics break text down into mutually irreconcilable positions. They point out the illogical things that are going on in the text, or the things where what is said is divorced from what is being intended. There is also in deconstructionist criticism a rejection of the quote myth that authors control language. Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault called for the death of the author because no author, no matter how brilliant, can fully control the meaning of the text. They've also called for death of literature as a special category of writing because it is merely words on a page, and that all texts are equally untrustworthy, and therefore literature deserves no status as art. This is an interesting perspective because it suggests that there's no absolute truth, that there are only rival interpretations. And you can see that deconstructionist criticism, while it may illuminate some interesting things, I think if taken too far, is the very kind of perspective that breeds nihilism and hopelessness. And I think honestly deconstructionist criticism has gone too far. That's just my personal opinion, but it does have some value in that it causes us to really carefully look at text in a way that's different from formalist criticism. We also have cultural studies. Cultural studies is a relatively new kind of interdisciplinary field in the university that's not solely associated with literary texts. It's not a study of fixed aesthetic objects, but of a dynamic social process. So the challenge in cultural studies is to identify and understand the complex forms and effects of the process of culture. Talk about trying to pin jelly to a wall. It is deeply anti-formalist. It investigates the complex relationship that exists among history, politics, and literature, and it rejects the notion that literature exists in an aesthetic realm separate from its ethical and political categories. And I have to admit, in putting together the reading list for this course, I struggled because there's only so much time and only so much space for us to have this course. And I had to make choices. And by making some choices, I had to leave other things out that I desperately wanted us to look at. But I also know that I couldn't cover everything. So this is a real thing. When you are sensitive to culture and how complex it is, the way that you do literary criticism is important. It's really about um, looking at literary analysis as a means of furthering social justice, and there's a huge responsibility there. So there's a commitment to examining the issues of race, class, and gender, as well as the shifting of the canon. And that's what I was talking about when I was choosing the things that we would read this semester. There are some texts that we're not going to touch that you would think normally you would find in a world lit class, but because I had to focus us for a purpose, I had to leave some things out. So the canon, what should be taught as literature, is changing based on the awareness that the culture is very broad. And that's what cultural studies criticism will kind of take a look at. Here's some additional modern schools of literary criticism. I'm not going to go into a huge discussion of these. I just want you to be aware of them. You can certainly study them out if you wish, if they are interesting to you and you want to learn about the theories as a means of providing yourself a lens through which you'd like to look at a text. That would be a worthwhile endeavor. So in sum, what you're doing when you do a literary analysis and you're writing, your goal is to open something up so that your reader can look at it a little more carefully. And I hope the material here has been helpful to you in perhaps opening your eyes a little bit to seeing all the very many things that are involved in making meaning from texts and what a joy it will be to read your papers as you struggle through them to make sense of them. Thank you.